Hi there, my name is Reese Chatham. Welcome to reeseastrology.fr. In this short video, I'm going to give you the basics of what an astrological chart is and how to read the various symbols and glyphs that we find on one. Here is a typical astrological chart. In natal astrology, a chart is cast for the moment of your birth. There's nothing mystical about this chart. All it is, it's a symbolic picture of the sky at the moment of your birth. Visualize yourself at the center of the chart. The horizontal line in the middle represents the horizon of the sky at the latitude where you were born. With you at the center, the chart shows the constellation of stars rising at the eastern horizon, the constellation that is culminating above you, and the constellation that is setting at the western horizon, and finally the constellation of stars below you on the other side of the Earth. Our planet Earth takes about a year to orbit around the Sun. The constellation of stars that are shown on the chart are the ones that lie directly behind the Sun as it makes its path around the Earth. It follows this same path every year. This path is called the ecliptic, and it is represented by this outer circle of the chart. The Sun, of course, rises at the eastern horizon. Because Western astrology was developed in the northern hemisphere, when we face south, the eastern horizon will be to our left. This became the standard when reading charts, regardless of what hemisphere of the globe we currently live in. We call this eastern point where the sun rises the ascendant. It's also known as the rising sign. The sun rises over the horizon on its path until it reaches its culmination point, that is to say, its highest point on the ecliptic. We call this point, logically enough, the midheaven. It's the point where the sun is the highest in the sky at the latitude where you were born. Once the sun has reached its highest point, it begins its downward, westward journey along the ecliptic until it sets below the horizon. The point where the sun sets is called the descendant. The sun is now below the horizon, and of course it's nighttime. It reaches its lowest point at the Imam Celi, or IC, after which it begins to rise again. And when it reaches the ascendant, we see the sun rise at the horizon. The Earth takes about a year to revolve around the sun. If we could look beyond the sun and see from our perspective on Earth which constellation of stars lie directly behind it, we would see the constellation change about once a month. From our perspective on Earth, it looks as though the sun is traveling around us. The apparent path that the sun takes around the Earth is called the ecliptic. There are 12 constellations of stars along the ecliptic, known as the zodiac. The stars of the constellations, or zodiac, are fixed in the sky. They do not move in relation to the rotation of the Earth around the sun or in relation to the rotation of the Earth. The Earth, as we all know, makes a complete rotation on its axis once every 24 hours. Because of this, for someone on a fixed point on Earth, the stars appear to be moving even though they are fixed. By the time 24 hours goes by, a person sitting at a fixed point on Earth and looking at the eastern horizon would theoretically be able to see all 12 signs of the zodiac appear at the eastern point over a 24-hour period. In an astrological chart, the outer ring represents the ecliptic, and you'll notice that there are 12 symbols or glyphs along the perimeter. These are the signs of the zodiac. In this chart, we start with Aries rising at the eastern point and continue in order: Aries, Taurus, Gemini, and so on. Because of Earth's rotation, the signs are moving in the same direction as the sun. So if at dawn we have the sign of Aries rising, a couple of hours later it will be in a different position, and we will have a new rising sign in its place. Because a new sign is rising about every 2 hours due to the Earth's rotation, another name for the ascendant is the rising sign. For reading an astrological chart, the 3 basic things you need to know are the symbols for the signs, which we have already covered. Then you need to know the symbols for the planets, which you see on this slide on the upper right. And finally, in astrology, we have these things called houses. We take the 360-degree circle of the sky and divide it into 12 equal sectors of 30 degrees each. Each of these sectors is called a house or a domicile, and any sign and planet contained within it is deemed to belong to that house. Let's go ahead and talk about what the planets represent in an astrological chart. There are a number of different approaches in Western astrology to interpreting planets in astrological charts. In the 20th century, astrology was heavily influenced by the psychology of Freud and Carl Jung. The chart was looked at as a map of the native psyche. In this system, we first look at the 7 visible planets and luminaries. The luminaries are the sun and moon, and the visible planets are Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These 7 visible luminaries and planets are viewed as representing components of the conscious mind. And the 3 outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, represent the unconscious mind. In Western astrology of the 20th century to the present, here's what each of these planets represents, speaking in general terms. So we have the sun, representing the ego, the life purpose, authority. We have the moon, representing the emotions, the body, nurturing, our habits. We have Mercury, which represents communication, expression, and commerce. We have Venus, which represents love, of course, and beauty, and the arts. We have Mars, which symbolizes our energy, also disputes and desire. We have Jupiter, which symbolizes good luck, symbolizes growth and hope, wisdom. We have Saturn, which represents structure, also restriction and limitation. Of course, the planets can represent many other things in addition to what I just listed. What a planet signifies exactly depends on what topic we're looking at. For example, the sun can represent the father, and the moon, the mother. Jupiter, a wise person or a judge. Saturn, an older person. Venus or Mars can represent a marriage partner. Mercury in one context can represent a young person. In another, it can symbolize an accountant or an orator. So what a planet represents changes according to the context. The 3 outer planets are Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Uranus had been sighted on many occasions prior to the Renaissance, but it was mistaken for a star or comet. It was finally identified as a planet in the latter part of the 18th century and is visible only when in a specific and narrowly defined phase in relation to the Sun. NASA defines Uranus as a planet that generally we can't view with the naked eye. Neptune, which we can only see with a telescope, was confirmed as a planet in the mid-19th century, and Pluto was discovered in the 1930s. In 20th century astrology, the outer planets began to be associated with the Jungian unconscious mind. So, generally speaking, Uranus represents change of all kinds of disruption, also of nonconformity. Neptune represents inspiration. It can stand for music, for dreams, confusion, dissolution, where we get lost. When we listen to music, we get lost. It's dissolution of the ego, if you like. It's the place where we forget ourselves. Pluto represents transformation of all kinds. It can also represent abuse of power. Elimination is a key word associated in 20th century astrology with Pluto, destruction. Also in evolutionary astrology with personal evolution. So this symbol here on the upper right-hand corner is a symbol for the moon's south node. It's where the moon meets the ecliptic, one of the two places. In traditional astrology, it's called the dragon's tail, but otherwise known as the moon's south node. It signifies challenging life lessons, restriction of all kinds. Traditionally, bad fortune are symbolized by the moon's south node. We move on now to the opposite node of the moon. It's called the moon's north node, traditionally known as the dragon's head, and it represents the opposite of the south node. It represents good fortune. Important life lessons are learned here. It's similar to Jupiter in terms of its symbolism of expansion. Finally, we have a lot or part of fortune, which you see here on the bottom left. This represents many, many things in traditional astrology, but if we have to narrow it down to one word, we can say that this is the arena of life where you'll be lucky. It's the part of fortune. So we have an idea now of what the planets represent in a chart. The position of each planet is also important, for their position places them in a particular astrological house. So let's turn our attention now to what the houses represent. We divide the circle of the astrological chart of 360 degrees into 12 sectors. Each of these sectors are called houses. An astrological house represents an arena of life. Here is a summary in broad strokes of what they symbolize. So we have the first house, which symbolizes you, your appearance, first impressions. It also represents literally your head or your face, what you look like. The second house represents your money. It's about finances of all kinds. Your movable possessions. It represents your income and assets. The third house traditionally has to do with siblings, your brothers and sisters, also short trips, your neighborhood, communication of all kinds. Traditionally, it's the house of a goddess, the house of a heretic, if you like. The fourth house represents father. In some contexts, it can represent both of the parents. It represents your home, what you're like behind closed doors, also your roots. In traditional astrology, it represents the end of things. It can represent your private life. The fifth house represents children, traditionally. For artists, it's a very important house because it represents their creativity. It represents pleasure, romance, amusements, sports. It also represents sex. The sixth house is traditionally the house of illness. It also represents daily routines, domestic animals, your pets. It stands for people who work for you. It can also represent, in general, your health. The seventh house represents traditionally marriage. In these days, it's any one-to-one serious relationship. It's partnerships of all kinds. Also enemies, if they're public enemies. The eighth house has to do with death, also with taxes, inheritance, debt of all kinds. Because it's the second house from the house of marriage, it can represent your partner's money. If the second house is your money, the eighth house can be your partner's money. Generally speaking, it can represent anxiety and worry. The ninth house has to do with travel, with higher education, with religion. Traditionally, it's the house of the god. The ninth house stands for anything that takes your mind further. If the third house is your thoughts, the ninth house is other people's thoughts. The 10th house is the culmination house. It's the house at whose cusp we have the midheaven. So it represents your reputation in the world, how people see you. Represents your career, your profession. It also represents mother. If the fourth house is father and the 10th house opposite is mother, it has to do with fame. Once again, anything to do with your reputation. The 11th house is the house of friends, of professional groups, of aspirations. Traditionally, it's the house of hopes and wishes. In traditional astrology, it's the house of the good daemon. The 12th house is the house of isolation. It's the house of hidden things, the house of the bad daemon. It's the house of hidden enemies. So this then is a quick summary of what each of the houses represents in astrology. The last element that we need to look at in chart reading are the astrological aspects. The geometrical relationships between the planets have symbolic meaning. These geometrical relationships are called aspects. The major aspects are the conjunction, which is when two planets are at the same longitudinal degree. The opposition, which is a geometrical aspect of 180 degrees. It symbolizes conflict, challenge, of kinds, depending on what the planets represent. The square is an aspect of 90 degrees. It represents a challenge, an opportunity, an adjustment. The trine is an aspect of 120 degrees. It represents your talents, things that are easy for you, things that are comfortable. The sextile is an aspect of 60 degrees. It represents opportunities of all kinds. It's very similar to the trine, but you have to put more effort into things. The trine of 120 degrees and the sextile of 60 degrees are called the soft aspects because they're easy aspects. They represent things that are easy for you in your natal chart. The square of 90 degrees and the opposition represent the hard aspects because both of them are challenging. You need them in your chart because they give you energy. If you only had trines, you wouldn't get up and do anything. You'd probably be very lazy because everything just would seem easy for you. The oppositions and the squares are important because they give you motivation to get up off your butt and do something. The conjunction, when you have two planets at exactly the same degree, can be good or can be difficult. It depends on what planets are involved. They involve a synthesis or concentration of the energies of both of the planets. In this slide, to the left, we have our sample chart with the aspect lines drawn in, connecting the planets. The blue lines, which you see over here, signify the soft aspects of a sextile or trine, and the red lines connect the hard aspects of a square and the opposition. So you can see them here. To the right, we have an aspect grid which conveniently lists all the aspects of a chart. So you can see at the top, we have a sextile between the moon and Venus. On the next row, on the fourth row of squares, we see that we have a square between Mars and the Sun, a conjunction between the moon and Mars, a trine between Mars and Mercury. On the next line, the Jupiter line, you see the Jupiter glyph on the left. We see we have a sextile with the moon, and those numbers mean that it's in an aspect of 0 degrees 22 minutes, so it's a very, very close aspect. Then we have a trine, which we see here, between Jupiter and Venus, 2s19. It means that it's separating from the perfect trine of 120 degrees by 2 degrees 19 minutes. So that means that the exact geometrical angle would be 222 degrees and 19 minutes. Thank you for listening. This concludes our introductory tour of the astrological chart. If you would like to download a free PDF copy of a key to the astrological glyphs and symbols that we discussed in this introduction, go to my website, reisastrology.fr, and click on Downloads on the menu, or click on the link in the description box of this video. At this site, you'll also find further information on astrological consultations and horary readings, also my contact information. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.